All right, everyone, welcome to the presentation on Plato's theory of the forms. What I'm going to do is just kind of take us through some notes of mine. I will make these notes available for you, but I think it's important that I walk you through them. Sometimes the notes can be a little vague, and it's unclear on what they mean. So in files, I'll put these notes up there, and that way you can have them at your disposal and maybe even follow along as you're watching the video here. So what I want to do is just bring these notes up, and let's see, here we go, and we'll share that. Okay, all right. So so here, let me just make this a little bit bigger. There we go. Okay, Plato's theory of forms. So right now, you should have gotten some good background on from the PowerPoint presentation what is going on. And if you've never encountered something like this, don't vex too much. Studying philosophy, and especially when you sort of encounter Plato's theory of forms the first time, it can be quite jarring. Like, what is he talking about? It can be a very strange experience, but hopefully it's becoming clearer as we go through. If not, just please let me know. I'm happy to help clarify some more. So we saw in the PowerPoint, let me just do a quick review here. We saw in the PowerPoint that Plato's theory of the forms consists of the problems that were posed by Heraclitus and Parmenides, right? The problems of being and becoming, right? Heraclitus, the world is constantly changing. All we have is flux. Right, his famous saying, you can never step into the same river twice. So for Heraclitus, sense perception tells us that nothing is permanent in the world. But there comes along Parmenides, right? Parmenides says, now hold on a second, right? We can't trust our senses. Our senses can be deceiving. All that we have is permanence, a unitary being, right? When he works through his logical, rational argument, he comes up with this sort of saying, what is, and what is not. One cannot pass into the other. If it does, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any logical sense. Whatever we're experiencing, the underlying insight is that nothing changes. Nothing in the world really is changing. So he denies change from a rational, logical point of view. Now, Plato argues that both philosophers were right to an extent, right? Certainly, we perceive change, right? There's order to the world. Babies don't grow up to be trees, right? There's some pattern. We have to recognize this, right? But there are changes, and that can't be denied either. So how do we, Plato was asking, account for both change and order? Well, for Plato, reality is not just one thing. It consists of two things, right? But these two things are not disconnected. They are related, and that's what we're going to have to talk about in a few moments, how these two worlds are related. And what Plato attempts to do is find an in-between position between the extremes of Heraclitus and Parmenides. The way of thinking about it is he attempts to reconcile the two opposing points of view. And he does so by making reality two things, right? So we can call it, and I like to use the word world. So world one that we inhabit possesses the characteristics of Heraclitus, flux and change, right? We perceive with our senses, this is undeniable. The world, the objects that we encounter, they come to be and pass away. I will come to be and pass away. Change seems to be present in all that we're, encountering. And Heraclitus is right to describe this world as impermanence, right? But there's also, Plato will tell us, because of the way he thinks about mathematics. So go back to the PowerPoint, right? The notion of mathematics or what math does for us. Well, for Plato, math is a very powerful example of showing us that beyond the physical world, right, there are ideas or forms, right? And we don't perceive these forms with our senses, but we do so, we apprehend them through thought or thinking. And to that extent, Parmenides is true, right? What he's saying is true. Our rational mind can apprehend something even though I'm not touching it or seeing it or sensing it in any way. And that is a truth that is independent of all of us, right? The truth of a square. regardless of when, where, and who, and all of that. Doesn't matter. The truth of the square is eternal. It endures, Plato is observing. Right, so the forms then, or eidos, that's the Greek word, eidos, or ideas. This is what Plato, the term that he uses to describe the non-physical, the non-temporal, the non-spatial world of the forms. Now, keep in mind that this is a response to the sophist, that this world is independent of human convention. Okay. And of course, the radical claim that Plato, or it's not radical for him, but it's sort of, for us, when you're first reading this, you're like, well, how could this be, right? The cup in my hand with this wonderful coffee, right? At least it's wonderful to me. This is another thing about the flux world. Isn't this most real, right? I can touch it, I can feel it. And Plato's going to say no. The reason why it's not as real as the forms or ideas is because in that world, the objects of knowledge never come to be and pass away. They stay put. They are eternal. And that's the key distinction that you want to get. Okay, so the sophists, of course, denied this claim. Okay. They denied, especially when Plato says it's not just about mathematics, that we can talk about an independent, non-spatial, non-temporal, objective, shared public world, right? Mathematics, we can do that. But Plato argues this can be extended to notions of morality and value. And the sophists are quick to deny this, that anything related to morality or value is a social convention. Human beings are the measure. Human beings make that up. Okay, there are no uber standards, right? Whatever the standard is, we create that standard. So, so Plato is going to get us to think that it's not just things like triangles, right, that are objects of thought. Think triangle, square. It doesn't matter at this point. Whatever easiest mathematical thought you can think of is a part of the object of thought of the world of forms and any other physical object. But it's also this idea of value and morality. I'm going to skip that notion of the notes because we just need to get to the relationship between these worlds here. So that's the question that Plato still needs to address, right? So Plato, you've given us two worlds. Well, what's the relationship between the non-spatial, non-physical, independent Platonic forms? I'm going to start using that word with the with the physical world. What's their relationship? Okay. So the first thing we have to think about is this bullet point here. Forms are not conceptual abstractions created by the human mind or social convention. For Plato, they are supreme above the world. They are manifested in time, and yet they are timeless. Right? How is this possible? Right? Forms are eternal and universal, but for Plato, they are more real than the particular physical things. Okay, let's get to one of Plato's really important concepts, and this is the concept of the divided line. At the end of the modules, I have a little video there from another person who's going to bring together the divided line with the allegory and the cave a little bit more explicitly. But right now, we just want to see what the divided line is all about. So as you're watching this, make sure you're taking some good notes to give you some distinctions here. So the process of knowledge that Plato describes is a divided line. And what he's showing is progress from ignorance or mere opinion to true knowledge of the forms. And what we're going to find in the Republic is this progress is really important for the training of citizens in the polis, but most importantly for the rulers, for the philosophers. And we'll see what that's all about here in a couple of modules. And I just want to introduce one word here that will become really important for Plato's allegory of the cave, and that is the form of the good. I don't want to say too much about it, except right now, the form of the good is really what the philosopher is after. That's what the philosopher is seeking to know. It's the highest form. It's the highest idea. At least in the Republic, that's what it is. And the form of the good becomes that form which illuminates all things. Okay, lots to say about that, but just hold on to that concept, the form of the good, just for right now. Okay, let's start going through this divided line. So anything that is known, right? Any object in the world is known, that is known, is illuminated by a higher state of knowledge. That's one premise you just want to get right now with Plato. That is, the highest form, the higher forms of knowledge illuminate the lower norms. And what does this mean? It means that the more general and the more abstract, okay, the more theoretical. Plato loves theory. Plato, and what is theory? Everything that we study pretty much in the West, right? Whether you're a psych major or a bio major, it doesn't matter. Theory is grounding your practice, grounding your learning. Okay, there is a theory behind, right? And theory for Plato is really important. The more theoretical for Plato, the more abstract means you know something really, really well. Okay, and the more abstract and the more theoretical illuminates the concrete things that we experience. Okay, thus we truly know when we know the abstract level, and that's what the divided line is meant to show. So, what is this divided line? So, let me bring up another document here to kind of show you what I'm looking at here. And I'll explain it. I'll explain once I share this, I'll walk us through what this is. So the divided line can be sort of thought about like this. This is a nice little summation of it. And I'm going to walk us through what this divided line is. And just kind of go as linear, in a linear way as I possibly can. So let's start with A. Divided line, section A. Plato calls this conjecture, opinion, or shadows. On this level, or in this section of the divided line, we can make out the shadow of, say, a table, which we could determine is not identical to the shadow of a horse. Let's say we have a shadow of a horse and a shadow of a table. We have enough information to form an opinion or a belief that this thing, the shadow of a table, is actually a table, and it's different from the shadow of a horse. Okay, let's say we have enough information about that. And if we have a collection of shadows, right, of the table, let's say we have different versions of the shadow of the table and its distinction from, say, a horse, even though it's dim, right, the shadow might be dim. If we have a collection of multiple shadows, we can determine that something is, right, more or less what we think the object is, a table or a horse, right? In order for shadows of something to exist, though, this is where Plato is going to make a really clear distinction, there must be things that exist to cast the shadow itself, right? In order to have the shadow, and here's language that I want you to get to know, the shadow is participating in the object that makes the shadow. Okay, so the shadow of a table is participating in the actual object table. The shadow depends on the object. The shadow does not exist unless the table does not exist unless the table itself exists, right? Or the actual object. Don't say itself. The object itself exists. Okay, and yet Plato says on this level, we don't have direct knowledge of those things themselves on this level. We only have shadows of things, right? He calls it likeness. right? That's another way of talking about it. Okay, look at B. Plato calls this belief of physical objects and things, which participate, again, let's use that language of participation. The object itself participates in the form of that something or thing, the idea, right? So like shadows that participate in physical objects, the things themselves, right? The table itself, or the horse, let's go to horse itself, participates in the form of hoarseness. Okay, let's kind of get that example out a little bit more. For example, individual horses tell us much about horses. I can have all kinds of different breeds of horses. I can have older horses, younger horses, different colors, different shapes, different sizes, different abilities, etc. Right? If I collected all of these horses, I could come up with a really good description of what it is I have an opinion about or a belief about, right? But there are many horses that differ in traits and characteristics, right? We all know that this is happening, but none tells us absolutely what a horse actually is. Experiencing a particular horse itself illuminates the shadow of the horse, right? So we've moved from shadows of things to the things in the physical world, right? But we still don't know what the essence of the horse is. We don't know horseness just yet, okay? So Plato will describe this as things. So when we're looking at the divided line, let's just stick with A and B right now. Look at the bottom there, and it says the physical world appearances. Okay, so when we have A and B, we have shadows and we have objects, and they're participating together. We are sensing the Heraclitean world, right? This is Heraclitus's appearances, and when we experience this world, we notice that things come to be and pass away. Okay. Now, from the last presentation, the claim that I'm making is that in order for B, right, the objects in the category of B, to exist, for me to have an experience of them, Plato's going to say, B has to participate in C. Let's just hold off on C and D just for right now, and to sort of get this notion. In the last PowerPoint, this is kind of where I ended. Is, what is a square? Well, it's a manifestation of a particular square that's participating in squareness, right? What makes a square a square? You and I can have an experience of a particular horse, and it's our unique experience, right? We can say, well, the horse is fast, or the horse is large, or the horse is whatever. We can disagree about various aspects of the horse depending on our own opinions, right? But for Plato, he's going to say, but at least we're all recognizing that we're perceiving or sensing a horse. And what is it that we're perceiving? Well, for Plato, that particular horse is participating in the essence of horseness. Okay, that's what he wants to say. We move from opinion to knowledge. And when we can zero in, right, on the hoarseness, on the thisness, the essence of something, that's knowledge. Now we're moving from opinion to knowledge. Okay, so keep your eyes on the divided line. Let's move to the right side. So when we move from B to C, from the physical appearance to the intelligible realm, C, the section C, Plato calls this understanding of the lower forms. Okay? We've got physical objects. These can tell us a lot of things about, whatever it is we're experiencing. But we can start to get a sense of the form or the idea of those objects. We make generalizations about those objects from the physical objects, and we understand the nature and essences of the objects themselves. So knowing the form, okay, just to be clear, knowing the form, the essence of objects and things, it illuminates our knowledge of the things themselves. Okay? Much like seeing a physical object, you could say, and not their shadows. When we see the form, okay, of something, and not merely, and by see, I don't mean physical sight, I mean apprehend, right? Intellectual, grasping, okay? And not merely the thing in the physical world. We see the thing for what it truly is. Plato calls this the lower forms, and this is intelligible realm for him. This is what he calls the intelligible realm. This is where science operates for Plato. Scientists are doing this, okay? Okay, let's jump over to D. So D, Plato is going to call intelligence, thinking, right? Thinking of the higher forms. These are the principles by which something, in fact, you could say for Plato, by which everything exists at all. So for Plato, the ultimate and primary form, at least at this stage in his writing, is what he's going to call the form of the good. And the form of the good illuminates all the lower forms of knowledge, all the way down to shadows. You cannot have a shadow unless you have an object. You cannot have an object unless you have the essence of that object. And you can't have essences unless you have the form of the good, the underlying principle, the foundation. And this word foundation is going to be really important in Western philosophy, especially when we get to metaphysics and epistemology during the Enlightenment period. And that's around 18th, 19th century Europe during that time. We'll get there. But the idea is that there's in order for anything to exist, there has to be a foundation that explains a fundamental principle, a fundamental insight, something that gives rise to the thing that we're talking about. Okay, let me offer a way of thinking about this, and I'm going to put my own self on the analysis here. Suppose I'm driving my car, and my car breaks down. And now you got to know something about me. I know nothing about car engines. I know nothing about cars, really. I know how to drive a car. I know how to put gas in a car. I know how to read the instruments and certainly play music in my car. But I know nothing about car engines, I couldn't explain to you how a car runs, and certainly when the car breaks down, there's nothing that I can do, right? So I'm completely dependent on my mechanic, Jeff, who graciously comes over and helps me with my automobiles. So let's suppose that my car, I'm driving around, a corner, and my car breaks down. I pull to the side and I pop the hood. Now, when I'm looking at the engine, I can see wires and gadgets and other parts, right? I can even probably call them by name. Oh, that's the carburetor, or that's where the oil goes, or something like that, right? Plato would say that I'm ignorant, okay? Right? I know nothing about this car. I can make out, let's say, likenesses and shadows, okay? But I can't tell you anything about the objects themselves. Now suppose my mechanic Jeff comes and not only knows the parts, right, but knows how to fix them. He has a techne, right? Let's go back to that language. He has a techne to fix a car, right? He can tell you how things connect. He can explain, at least on some level, why certain things are not working and how to address them, etc. But he can fix the car. But if I were to press Jeff, or let's say a person who's an engineer who has studied, science on a really complex level, will come to Jeff, and let's just say this is true. I don't know anything about Jeff apart from this, but let's say he comes to Jeff and he says, "Well, Jeff, you can explain how to fix the car. What's the problem with the car? But can you explain why fundamentally the car does what it does, right? In terms of not just combustible engines, but also theories of physics, right? Can you give a physicist account? Can you give a scientific account, right? So Jeff might have a really great opinion, Plato would say, about the about the engine, about cars, right? He might have a really good one, right? How to work with engines. What Jeff needs to know, according to Plato, to really say he has knowledge, is why the engine works the way that it does. Maybe Jeff does, right? But what Plato is asking is more than just mere explanation. You need a theory of heat engines, right? A theory of, how gasoline, the fundamental stuff that makes the world what it is in this respect with cars. What's going on? Can you give an explanation? Can you give a theory and account of all of that? The laws of heat theory, for example. Okay. And let's say our physicist, our engineer can start to describe this from a scientific account. At that point, notice what has happened. We've moved far away from the engine itself, and now we're asking about theories of heat and theories of this and theories of that, right? The laws, right? The principles. What Plato's going to say is you've gone, at that point, you have moved away from the physical appearances of things and you've tapped into understanding. And you're in the realm of intelligence. You're in the realm of theory, okay? But Plato's going to say, even with a theory of heat, we still don't have a complete knowledge that illuminates all of our experience here. So for the final level, Plato says we need knowledge of the first principles. Okay, what are these first principles? The basic assumptions of all knowledge, the fundamental, original source of how knowledge itself comes to be what it is. Okay, fundamental stuff here, foundational stuff. Again, go to that term there. So let's summarize here, right? The process of knowing with the divided line is a movement from being to being only observant in our sense experience of shadows, moving to the things themselves, right? But then contemplating, apprehending the form or the essences of things. But ultimately, Plato says, we want to get to the condition. We want to get to the bottom of it all. That's where the philosopher is headed. And again, he's going to say that fundamental place where we're headed is the form of the good. And for Plato, if it could be known, if the form of the good can be known, it would be true knowledge that is complete, infallible, incorruptible. And what it does is that it illuminates all the forms of knowledge that we have. In order to have anything at all, Plato would argue in terms of knowledge now, is to have this foundational principle. Okay, all right. I just walked you through a really difficult piece in Plato's philosophy. I'm going to post these notes on Canvas. If you have questions, certainly email those to me. This will prepare you for the allegory of the cave, if you haven't read that yet. So the allegory of the cave is simply Plato's descriptive, more literary way of describing what's happening with the divided line. So in the last module of this week, you have that section right there with the allegory of the cave, a little video to help put it all together, and then we'll finish up with Plato.